Graska of Iron Tusk had learned to laugh with her teeth. It was how orcs kept the world from thinking they were afraid, how they kept themselves from admitting it too. So when the war horns wailed from the ridge and the lookout's scream cracked the dusk, ashen banners, 10,000, Graska bared her tusks, threw her axe onto her shoulder like it weighed nothing, and turned that laugh on the man beside her. Elias Vance stood at the edge of the palisade with both hands on the rough-hewn timber, watching the plain below. He didn't flinch, he didn't spit, he didn't make the ritual roar that answered the horns, he just watched. Of course he did, because he was human, because he was soft, because he was her husband. Graska's chest tightened with something like shame and something like anger that tasted the same. Not at him, she told herself, at the clan, at the whispers. At the way the older warriors had smiled when the marriage drums beat, like her choice had been a joke told around a fire. Graska had chosen him anyway, and now the world had come to collect the price. Still standing like a fence post, she said loudly for the warriors clustered nearby to hear, while the rest of us go earn our scars. A few of them chuckled. One of the younger tusks, Keth, snorted and muttered, "Human-s gonna get blown over by the wind." Elias didn't look at them. His eyes were a pale, steady gray winter sky before a storm. "I'm standing," he said calmly, "because I'm counting." "Counting?" Graska scoffed. "You count sheep, human, we count heads." He finally turned his face toward her. There was no offense in it, no heat, just a patient tiredness that made Graska feel suddenly like the loud one, like the small one. "How many arrows do we have?" he asked. The question hit like a thrown stone, not because it was hard, but because it was the wrong kind of question. Orcs didn't win wars with numbers on a slate. They won with courage and blood and the certainty that their ancestors watched. Graska's jaw flexed. "Enough. That's not a number." "3 crates," someone offered from behind, as if apologizing. Elias nodded once. "How many spears?" A pause. "2 racks," another said, "plus what's in the longhouse." Elias looked back to the plain. Graska turned away with a harsh laugh to keep her face from showing what she hated most, doubt. "Ask your questions later. When we're not about to be trampled." The horns sounded again, closer, louder, thick with urgency. Ashen Covenant banners unfurled along the ridge like a dark wound opening across the land. Thousands moved beneath them, a tide of bodies and iron and smoke. Their war drums rolled, low and slow, like a giant's heartbeat. Graska had fought raiders, border bands, rival clans. She had never seen an army like this. Her warriors saw it too. Their laughter died, their grips tightened. They set their feet as if the earth could be commanded to hold. The chieftain's voice rose from the center tower. "Iron Tusk, we hold this pass. We hold our children behind us." "We," a new sound cut him off, the crackling hiss of burning pitch. The Ashen Covenant had brought fire tubes. Thin trails of flame streaked from the ridge, arcing high, and then the first clay pots shattered against the palisade. Fire bloomed. Smoke slapped the air. Men and women shouted, beating at it with cloaks and sand. Graska's instinct screamed, "Charge, close the distance. Break their line before their strange weapons did." She lifted her axe and roared. She was Graska, Iron Tusk, carved by battle, and the roar spread, taking her warriors with it. Then a hand closed around her wrist, not a grip of domination, not a warrior's clamp, a blacksmith's grip, strong in a different way, steady, deliberate. "Elias." "Don't," he said. Graska whirled, fury flashing. "Get your hand off." "Look," he said and pointed, not to the ridge but to the ground. At first she didn't understand. Then her eyes followed his finger and she saw it. The slope between the fort and the ridge wasn't flat. It dipped. It rose. It hid shallow gullies like scars, and in those gullies, half covered by the dusk, were stakes. Ashen Covenant had planted them, sharpened and angled upward, hidden beneath cut grass and dust. A charging line would hit them at full speed. Orcs would die with their own momentum. Graska's throat went dry. Elias didn't gloat, didn't say "I told you so." He just looked at her like she was someone worth saving. "You want to charge," he said. "They want you to charge." Graska felt the eyes of her warriors on her back, felt the clan's judgment waiting to be shaped. She could rip her arm free, roar again, and lead them into the trap, or she could listen to a human. Her pride was a hot animal in her chest, clawing to be let loose. But the stakes in the gullies were colder than pride. Graska swallowed bloodless air. "Keth," she barked, "get runners to the chieftain, tell him trap field stakes." Keth stared like he'd been slapped. Then seeing her face, he nodded and sprinted. The fire tubes hissed again, a pot smashed near the gate. The gate creaked under heat, smoke rolled along the wall, stinging eyes turning the air into a mouthful of ash. Elias stepped into motion as if he'd been waiting for permission. "Buckets," he called. "Sand first, water last. Water spreads burning pitch." Orcs looked at him like he'd grown a second head. Graska opened her mouth to shout him down, "Who are you to command?" Then she saw the pitch crawling along the timber like a living thing and remembered the first winter they'd spent together when a hearth fire had caught the roof thatch and Elas had saved their home by smothering flame instead of feeding it with panic. Her lips snapped shut. Buckets. She roared, making it an orc command so her warriors would obey without tasting the shame of obeying a human. They moved, sand poured, fire hissed, smoke thickened, but the palisade held. Below, the Ashen Covenant army began to advance. Not in a wild rush, but in disciplined blocks, shield walls, spear lines, archers, and behind them the fire tube crews dragging their tools like priests dragging altars. Graska's heart hammered. She had fought her whole life in battles where one brave charge could break a foe's will. This was different. This was an enemy that expected to win through patience. Elias watched with narrowed eyes. "They're not here to raid," he murmured. "They're here to take the pass and keep it." "Why?" Graska demanded, though she already knew. The pass led to the Iron Tusk Valley, to their grazing lands, to their river, to their children, to their dead buried in the old hills. "They'll cut us off from winter food," she said, voice raw, "starve us, then march in and take what's left." Elias nodded as if starve and march were ordinary words. "Then we can't let them camp here." Graska laughed again, harsh and bitter. "And how, human, you going to count them to death?" He finally looked at her fully. In the smoke and firelight, his face was smudged with soot. There was a faint scar at the edge of his eyebrow, a line the clan had never asked about because humans didn't matter enough to collect histories from. His eyes held something old. "You know what they call me where I come from?" Asked softly, Graska scowled. "I don't care what soft folk called you." He didn't rise to it. "They called me Vance the Bell Ringer." Graska blinked. The name meant nothing. Elias gestured toward the longhouse behind them where Iron Tusk stored their winter grain and smoked meat. "How much of that food is in sacks?" "What?" Graska snapped. "Enough. Why, how many sacks can you carry out if you had to leave in an hour?" Graska's pulse spiked. "Leave," the word tasted like treason. Elias' gaze didn't waver. "If the gate falls, you'll leave whether you want to or not. I'm asking so you don't die in front of your children trying to be proud." Pride reared again, furious. Then another flaming pot shattered and Graska heard a child scream from the inner yard where families huddled. Her pride shrank under the sound. Elias stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Graska, listen, I'm not asking you to abandon the pass. I'm asking you to be ready to move what matters if we must. And I'm asking because I have an idea, but it needs hands." Graska wanted to spit, wanted to say you don't get ideas in war, but her arms were heavy with the truth. The enemy wasn't playing by the rules she'd grown up with. Maybe the rules had already changed. "What idea?" she growled. Elias' mouth twitched, not a smile, not quite. "You have a bell tower." Graska stared. "A bell." It sat on the tallest post near the center, an old bronze bell stolen generations ago from a lowland monastery, used to call the clan to counsel or warn of storm. Elias pointed to it like it was a blade. "Does anyone know why bells mattered in old wars?" Graska's brow furrowed. "To make noise. To send messages," Elias said, "to time movements and to hide other sounds." Graska's eyes narrowed and something like understanding began to creep in, slow as dawn. "Hide what sounds?" Elias' gaze flicked to the ridge, to the moving blocks of soldiers. "Digging, building, anything you don't want them to hear." Graska's mind raced. "We can't dig out from under them, the ground, not under them," Elias said, "under us." Then he grabbed a bucket and shoved it into the hands of a stunned warrior. "Sand line here now." Graska watched him move, watched the way he saw the fort not as sacred ground, but as a thing that could be shaped, used, weaponized, like steel. "Why do you keep looking at the ground?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice sharp. "What are you really counting?" Elias glanced at her. "Seconds." "Seconds," he pointed toward the advancing enemy. "Watch their pace, listen to their drums, count the time between commands." Graska listened. The Ashen Covenant drums beat in a pattern, steady, measured. Their lines moved with each beat like a breathing beast. Elias' jaw tightened. "They're not going to hit us full force, they'll set up. They'll throw fire until our gate weakens, then they'll send sappers to tear it down while archers cover them." Graska felt cold. "Sappers, diggers," Elias said. "They'll dig toward the base of the wall and undermine it, or they'll bring rams. Either way, they win by breaking our structure." Graska's hands curled into fists. "Then we go out and break theirs." Elias' eyes flashed. "Yes, but not with a charge into their stakes." He motioned to the bell tower. "Ring it." Graska stared. Now, he insisted. "Not the warning toll, the council toll, fast, relentless." Graska hesitated only a heartbeat, then whistled sharply. Two warriors sprinted to the rope and yanked. The bell's voice crashed over the fort, deep, brassy, impossible to ignore. It cut through smoke, through shouting, through fear. It was the sound of Iron Tusk gathering for judgment. Warriors turned from the walls, eyes snapping toward the center. Elas climbed onto a crate and spoke into the chaos without yelling. He didn't need to. Something in his tone carried. "I need rope," he said. "All of it. I need barrels of oil, cooking oil, lamp oil, anything. I need every empty cask and every clay jar you can spare. I need the women who brew, the men who fix wagons, and anyone who can swing a hammer without swinging it at my head." A ripple of laughter tried to start, then died when they saw Graska standing beside him, axe on shoulder, eyes hard. "He speaks with my tusk," Graska growled. "Move." And so they moved, because orcs understood command when it came in the shape of certainty. Elas jumped down and turned to Graska. "How many hunters do you have who can move fast in the dark?" 30, Graska said automatically. "Maybe 40. "I need 20, Elas said. "The quiet ones, the ones who can crawl." Graska's gaze sharpened. "To do what?" Elas pointed toward the stake field. "Those traps aren't meant for us alone. They'll slow anyone. They know where they are." "Not all of them," Elas said. "Not at night, not when their own men are tired, not when they think we're trapped behind burning walls." Graska felt a grin claw its way onto her face, fierce and sudden. "You want to lure them into their own teeth." Elas' expression stayed grim. "I want to make the ground itself our ally." The bell kept ringing. The fort became a hive. People ran with barrels, with rope, with clay jars. Children were shoved into safer corners. Elderly were moved away from the walls. Warriors hauled sand and water. Smoke rolled upward like a prayer made of ash. Graska watched Elas coordinate, and a strange sensation rose in her chest, the uneasy recognition that he was not improvising, he was remembering. At the edge of the yard, she caught Keth watching Elas with open suspicion. "Speak," Graska snapped. Keth jerked. "Chieftain says the human can bark as long as you stand beside him," but he lowered his voice. "Why does he know war like this? Humans don't fight like us." Graska looked at Elas, who was kneeling beside a barrel, showing a brewer how to tie a knot that wouldn't slip when soaked. "I don't know," Graska admitted. And that admission from her mouth tasted like stepping off a cliff. Night fell like a blade. Ashen Covenant halted at bow range and began to set up their camps and siege tools with infuriating calm. Their fires dotted the ridge, their drums slowed. They were waiting to starve Iron Tusk out or burn them out. Graska stood on the palisade, watching. Elas joined her, carrying 2 cups of bitter herb tea. He handed one to her without comment. Graska took it, then stared at it like it might bite. Orcs didn't drink tea in war, they drank blood, wine, and rage. But her throat was scorched with smoke, and the tea cut through it, grounding her. For a moment they stood shoulder to shoulder in silence. Then Graska said, quietly so no one else could hear, "You make it look easy." Elas didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the enemy fires. "It's not easy," he said finally. "It's familiar." Graska's hands tightened around the cup. "What did you do before you came to Iron Tusk?" Elas' jaw flexed. "I ran from a war I didn't believe in," he said, voice flat. "I thought I could build instead of break. I thought I could be someone else." Graska's pride bristled. "Running is not," he turned his head slightly. His eyes caught the firelight and looked older than any human had a right to look. "I didn't run because I was afraid to die," he said softly. "I ran because I was afraid of what I was becoming." Graska's mouth closed. The words landed heavy. Below them, an Ashen Covenant horn blew, a single note taunting. The enemy was close enough now that Graska could hear their laughter carried on the wind. They thought Iron Tusk was caged. Elas set his cup down and pointed at the gate. "See that?" Graska squinted. The gate was reinforced with iron bands, old and sturdy. But the pitch had blackened the outer layer. It wouldn't take a full day of fire tubes before it started to crack. "I see it," she said. "We've sealed the inner frame," Elas said, "but we can't stop them forever. That's why we don't try." Graska frowned. "Then what do we do?" Elas' gaze hardened. "We hit them tonight." Graska's blood surged. "Now you speak like an orc." Elas' mouth twitched. "No, I speak like a man who has watched a siege eat a city from the inside. The enemy wants time." "We don't give it to them." Graska felt her heart thump. "And your plan?" Elas leaned closer. "We make them believe the gate is failing." Graska's eyes widened. "We," Elas raised a hand, "controlled, we char the outer planks, we make noise, we let them see smoke, we let them smell weakness." Graska's grin returned sharper. "And when they come," Elas' voice dropped, "they come through a narrow choke, into oil-slick ground, into their own stake field, into darkness where your quiet hunters are waiting." Graska's tusk showed. "And you?" Elias looked back toward the bell tower where rope and barrels had been hauled up earlier. His expression went distant. "I'll ring the bell," Graska blinked. "You already did." "I'll ring it when it matters," Elias said. "When the sound tells your hunters to move, when it covers their footsteps, when it makes the enemy think our panic is louder than our plan." Graska stared at him. He wasn't an orc. He wasn't brave in the way Iron Tusk defined bravery, charging, roaring, taking wounds on the front line, but he was brave in a different way. He was willing to be the thin point of the spear no one noticed until it was in your throat. Graska's chest tightened, and then because pride was a habit as much as it was a shield, she said the thing she would regret. "Don't get yourself killed," she muttered. "It would be embarrassing to be widowed by a bell rope." Elias looked at her for a long moment, no anger. Just that winter sky steadiness. "Embarrassing," he repeated softly. "Right." Then he turned away to give orders. Graska watched him go, and for the first time the laughter in the enemy camp didn't sound like mockery. It sounded like a countdown. They staged the weakness well. Just before midnight, Iron Tusk's gate smoked again, thin wisps at first, then thicker, as if the inner beams had finally caught. Warriors shouted and cursed and poured water. The sound carried. Elias made sure it carried. He had them drag a half-burnt plank into view and throw it from the wall so it landed with a crack and a shower of embers. The Ashen Covenant camp stirred. Graska crouched with her 20 quiet hunters beyond the inner yard, hidden under dark cloaks, faces smeared with ash. They would slip out through a side sallyport low and silent and crawl into the gullies where the stake traps waited. The plan was ruthless, elegant, terrifying. It was human. Graska hated how much she admired it. From the ridge, an answering horn blew short and sharp. Shapes began to move. A detachment of enemy soldiers, hundreds, broke from the main camp carrying ladders, ropes, and a heavy ram. Graska's breath steamed in the cold. Elias stood at the bell tower, hands on the rope, face set. He glanced down once, found Graska's eyes, and nodded. No speech, no vow, just the nod of someone who trusted her to do the bloody part. Graska nodded back, then signaled her hunters. They melted into the darkness. The enemy detachment approached, cautious at first, then faster as they saw the smoke. Their officers shouted. Their shields formed a wedge. They reached the stake field. Graska held her breath. For a moment it seemed like they might slow, like someone might remember the traps. Then a shout came from behind them, impatient. They pushed forward. The first man screamed as a stake punched through his boot into his foot. He fell, knocking into the next. The line stumbled. Confusion rippled. And then before they could regroup, the bell tower exploded with sound. Elias yanked the rope hard, ringing not the slow council toll but a frantic, relentless clang that made the air itself vibrate. To the enemy it sounded like panic. To Graska's hunters it was a drumbeat, a cloak of noise, a signal that the throat was open. From the gullies shadows rose. Orc hunters moved like wolves, silent, fast, blades flashing in the dark. They pulled men down into the stakes. They cut ropes. They sliced fingers from ladder rungs. The Ashen Covenant detachment broke apart, trying to see, trying to understand, but the bell's sound swallowed their shouted commands. Graska sprang into motion, leading the second wave through the sallyport, axes low, feet careful to avoid the hidden stakes they now owned. She hit the enemy wedge like a falling tree. Steel rang. Blood splattered warm against cold air. Orcs roared, not to scare themselves into courage, but to tell the world they were alive. The enemy fought hard. Ashen Covenant were disciplined, trained. They did not flee at the first shock, but they were blind, tangled in their own trap field, and Iron Tusk was a beast that knew every rock and rut. Graska split shields, crushed skulls, drove her axe into a man's chest and felt his life shudder out. Through it all the bell kept ringing, and then the bell stopped. The sudden silence hit like a punch. Graska's head snapped up. On the wall above the gate, a new flame blossomed, too bright, too fast. The enemy had fired a volley of pitch pots at the gate again, and this time the fire had taken. The outer planks sagged, the iron bands groaned. A heavy shadow moved behind the flames, the Ashen Covenant ram being pushed forward by a fresh squad while Graska's warriors were engaged outside. They weren't just trying to break in, they were using the skirmish as cover. Graska's throat went raw. Back to the gate, but her voice was swallowed by battle. She began to turn, then she saw him. Elias. He was on the ground in front of the gate. Alone, no axe, no shield, just a short spear in one hand and a coil of rope in the other. For a heartbeat, Graska thought her eyes were lying. That smoke had drawn a cruel shape in the dark. Then Elias planted his feet wide on the charred earth and raised the spear. The ram squad slowed, startled. Humans didn't stand in front of rams. Humans didn't stand in front of anything. Elias did. Graska's blood froze. "What are you doing?" She screamed and the sound ripped out of her like a piece of soul. Elias didn't look back. He threw the rope. It looped around the ram's forward beam, around the iron-capped head like a noose. Then Elias yanked, not to stop the ram, impossible, but to angle it. The ram lurched, momentum carrying it, and its heavy head slammed not into the gate but into the stone base to the left where Elias had dragged a hidden oil barrel earlier. The barrel ruptured. Oil spilled across the ground like black water. The enemy shouted in alarm. Elias struck flint and steel, quick, practiced sparks catching on the oil-soaked rags he'd laid beneath. Fire whooshed up in a wall. The ram squad screamed as flames crawled up their boots. They stumbled back into the stake field. Graska watched in horror and awe as enemy bodies fell into their own trap under the weight of panic. Elias stepped forward through heat and smoke like he didn't feel it. He jabbed with the spear, not wildly but with cold precision, keeping the ram away from the gate, forcing the enemy to retreat. A fire tube crew tried to angle their weapon down toward him. Elias turned, grabbed a burning plank from the ground and hurled it like a spear. It struck the crew's pitch pot pile. Flame erupted. The crew vanished in a burst of fire and screaming. Graska's mind broke for a moment under the image. Her quiet human husband moving like a man who had done this before, like a bellringer calling death with his hands. And then an Ashen Covenant officer, taller, armored, face painted in ash, charged Elias with a curved sword. Elias met him, not with strength, he couldn't match that, with timing. He stepped inside the sword's arc, took a shallow cut across his shoulder, and drove the spear's butt into the officer's knee. The officer stumbled, and Elias slammed the spearhead up under the man's ribs. The officer fell. Elias didn't cheer. He turned back toward the gate, breathing hard, blood dark against his shirt. The ram lay half-burned, abandoned. The gate still smoked, but it still stood. Graska's throat tightened so hard she could barely breathe. She forced her body to move, cutting her way through the last of the enemy outside the walls, shoving past her own warriors. She reached Elias and grabbed his arm. "You," she began. Her voice failed. Elias finally looked at her. His face was pale beneath soot, his eyes sharp with the afterglow of violence. For the first time tonight he looked afraid, not of the enemy, of her, of what he had shown. "I told you," he said hoarsely. "I was counting seconds." Graska's tusks trembled. "You stood alone." Elias tried to shrug and winced, blood seeping. "Someone had to. The gate. You could have died," Graska hissed. Elias' gaze flicked toward the inner yard where children's cries had quieted, where elders watched through smoke. "If I died there," he said softly, "they live." Graska's chest cracked. Shame rushed in hot, choking, all her loud laughter, all her public mockery. She had called him soft, and he had just faced an enemy army's spearpoint with rope and fire and a plan. Graska swallowed hard. The battlefield around them still rang with dying screams and the crackle of burning oil. But in that moment, everything narrowed to this, her hand on his arm and the truth she had refused to see. "I belittled you," she said, voice ragged, "in front of them." Elias' eyes held hers. Yes, no forgiveness, no comfort, just the fact. Graska's pride tried to rise one last time, wounded and snarling. She crushed it with her fist. "I did it," she said, "because I was afraid." Elias blinked once, surprised. "Afraid they were right," Graska whispered. "Afraid I chose wrong. Afraid you would break and I would be the fool who brought a breakable thing into Iron Tusk." Elias' mouth opened slightly, then closed. Graska tightened her grip, not hurting him, just holding him like he might vanish if she let go. "You did not break," she said. "You," her voice failed again. Elias exhaled, a shaky breath. "I didn't want you to see me like that." "Like what?" Graska snarled, half sobbing now, angry at the wetness in her eyes. "Like a warrior." Elias' gaze drifted to the burning ram, to the bodies in the stake field. "Like someone who knows how to make men die," he said quietly. Graska's jaw flexed. "We all know." Elias looked back at her, and for the first time there was something raw in his eyes. "Not like this," he murmured. "Not with plans that turn the ground into a knife, not with cold." Graska stared at him. Then she did what orcs did when words ran out. She pulled him into her chest and wrapped her arms around him, shielding him from the world as if her body could become a wall. He stiffened, then slowly he sagged into her, breath shaking. Around them, Iron Tusk warriors began to realize what had happened. They saw the burned ram. They saw the enemy detachment broken. They saw Elias standing at the gate, bloodied, smoke-streaked, alive. Whispers flickered through the ranks like fire through dry grass. Human stood, human held gate, human burned ram. Keth stared at Elias like he was seeing a legend being born. Graska lifted her head and glared at the clan with a ferocity that dared them to laugh. No one laughed. The Ashen Covenant, seeing their detachment destroyed and their ram ruined, began to fall back toward the ridge, dragging wounded, abandoning the idea of a quick breach. They would return tomorrow, perhaps with more fire, more patience. But tonight they had learned something. Iron Tusk was not caged. Iron Tusk had teeth in the dark. And a bellringer who knew how to make time itself into a weapon. By dawn, the ridge was quieter. Ashen Covenant still held their camp, but their confidence had shifted. Their lines were tighter. Their scouts moved with more caution. They had stopped laughing. Graska sat on the wall beside Elas, who had been bandaged by the healers with rough efficiency. His shoulder was wrapped and his arm shook slightly from blood loss and exhaustion. He looked human again, which somehow was more terrifying than when he'd looked like a war spirit. Graska watched the plain in silence. Then she said in Iron Tusk, when a warrior shames another, they repay it. Elias' gaze slid toward her, wary. Repay how? Graska swallowed. The words were heavy, but she forced them out. Publicly, she said, in the same place the shame was given. Elias' mouth tightened. Graska, you don't? I do. She stood, ignoring the ache in her limbs, and strode to the bell rope. Warriors looked up, startled. The chieftain's eyes narrowed. Graska grabbed the rope and rang the council toll, slow, steady, commanding. When the clan gathered in the yard, soot-streaked and tired, Graska stepped onto the crate where Elias had spoken. She looked at the faces that had laughed. She looked at Keth. She looked at the chieftain. Then she turned toward Elias, who stood stiffly, uncertain, as if ready to take a blow. Graska lifted her axe, not threatening, but as a symbol. My husband, she said loudly, voice carrying, stood alone against the enemy's ram and lived. He saved our gate. He saved our children. A murmur rippled. Graska's tusks bared, not in laughter, but in truth. And I mocked him. I did it for pride. I did it because I feared what you would think of me. The yard went still. Graska drew in a breath that felt like swallowing fire. I was wrong. Her voice didn't waver. In Iron Tusk, a warrior who is wrong does not hide. Oh, hear me? Elias Vance is not soft. He is not lesser. He is my equal. Her hand tightened on the axe handle. And any who speak against him speak against me. Silence held thick and tense. Then the chieftain stepped forward. He studied Elias with the eyes of someone weighing iron. Finally, he nodded once. A gate that holds, he rumbled, is a weapon. A mind that holds is a weapon too. He turned to the clan. We fight the Ashen Covenant with every weapon we have. Then he looked at Elias. Bellringer, your bell saved us. Elias' face flickered, relief, discomfort, something like grief. He bowed his head slightly. It wasn't just the bell, he said. It was Graska, it was your hunters, it was everyone. The chieftain's mouth twitched. Humans always share credit, he grunted, as if suspicious of it. A few orcs chuckled, soft, not cruel. Graska felt a knot in her chest loosen for the first time since the horns had sounded. Elias stepped closer to her. His voice was low, meant only for her. You didn't have to do that. Graska's gaze stayed forward. Yes, I did. Elias hesitated. Why? Graska's jaw flexed. She could have said because it's right, because that was the orc way, but she was tired of hiding behind ways, so she told the truth. Because if you die, she whispered, I want them to remember you as you are, not as the joke I made. Elias' breath caught. Graska finally turned her head, meeting his eyes. And because, she added, voice rough, I don't want to be afraid of you. Elias stared at her, then slowly reached up with his uninjured hand and touched her forearm, gentle, grounding. I'm afraid of me too, he admitted. Graska snorted, a sound halfway between a laugh and a growl. Good, then we match. Elias' mouth curved faintly. We match. Beyond the walls, Ashen Covenant banners still stained the horizon. There would be more fire, more blood, more counting of seconds. But Iron Tusk had learned something in the smoke and darkness. Strength wasn't only in the swing of an axe. Sometimes strength was in the hands that tied the rope, rang the bell, and stood alone in the worst place because someone had to. Graska lifted her axe and looked out at the enemy camp. Come, she murmured, tusks showing. We are ready now. And beside her, the human husband she had mocked stood straight, winter sky eyes steady, not because he wanted glory, because he had something worth holding. Because this time he would not stand alone.